Oh, did you see the boom mic? Holy crap! Things like look at it. It dips in and then it comes back in.
You could see the arm.
Yeah. Hey guys, I'm Heavy,
And I'm Treby.
and today on Suspenders of Belief we watched the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
This is a cult classic from 1975 that was originally a stage play. It's a musical as well, and it's largely a lot of fun with a lot of references to old science fiction and horror movies. It's ultimately a love letter to that era of kind of schlock filmmaking. It has a lot of LGBT and queer, not even subtext. It's literally on screen, so it's not even subtle.
That's the one thing about the Rocky Horror Picture Show that's kind of transcended the idea of a cult movie in and of itself. Is a lot of times it's kind of referred to as like the big first cult movie, but even the idea of what a cult movie is, people kind of argue over. Some people consider The Wizard of Oz a cult movie because it had a terrible launch and then it had a huge following in home video. But the Rocky Horror Picture Show kind of transcends every good bad movie from Birdemic to The Room to Troll 2 because the Rocky Horror Picture Show has been running for over 40 years, selling out midnight showings, and it's still going. You know, this is not a new trendy thing. Like, they were doing this for so long.
I mean, there are earlier movies that have cult followings, but this is the one that is really quite the phenomenon because, like you said, it's still consistently being played. It has a huge amount of audience participation involved in it, and it's very beloved. I think, to me, part of what makes it work is that it rides a pretty good line between having some genuinely good bits in it. It's not entirely garbage. It's not entirely the worst thing I've ever seen. It's just kind of fascinating in how they threw everything in the kitchen sink into it.
Well, it's also kind of a celebration in a bunch of different ways. It's a celebration of being strange. It's a celebration of breaking the norm of what society expects of you. Things like tattoos, riding motorcycles, things like that it's pretty tame by today's standards, but at the time it was meant to be shocking.
I've always interpreted as a celebration of social deviancy in whatever capacity you want that to be, whether it is, like you said, oh, I have tattoos, I have long hair, I wear a leather jacket, I drive a motorcycle, I like boys, I like girls, I am a different gender. You know, it's all wrapped up in it. It doesn't explore all those things equally, but the idea is that it is a celebration. It's marking everything to be valid within that umbrella, and it's pretty cool. And I think that's why so many people respond to it, because anybody who feels out in the outside in any capacity can relate to it, even no matter how subtle. It has something for everybody in that way.
The Rocky Horror Picture Show, before it was a movie, though, was originally written for the theater, and there's a lot of elements that bleed into it, because you obviously have things like the Hammer horror influence with things like a Frankenstein reference, sometimes it's a Dracula reference, and even to the point of like some of the sets that they actually film on were some of those classic Hammer locations. It's interesting that it is both kind of a celebration of those old tropes, but also kind of turning them on their head, because rather than it just being about a crazy scientist who builds a monster, which does happen in fact in the movie.
He makes a typical literature style Frankenstein monster so that he could have sex with it.
There's an activity that you sometimes do in like a creative class, sometimes in a writing class, sometimes in a speech class, where you start telling a story and you're writing it just as fast as you can, and then after 60 seconds you pass it to the person and they're only allowed to look at the last line and they have to try to continue the story. The script kind of feels like that, where it's like, okay, these two people are at a wedding and then they're driving their car, but now the car breaks down so they have to go walking out, but it's also in a storm, and the storm, so they have to look for a shelter, and they find a shelter, but the shelter's really a castle. When you try to actually look at step by step what happens in this movie, it almost feels like they're making it up as they go. So it has this kind of chaotic feeling where when you're watching it as an audience perspective, you're constantly trying to guess what's going to happen, and it is such an off-the-rails type of narrative that I don't think you can, going into it the first time, even know what's going to happen.
We're pretty familiar with this movie, and going into it, we're all like, wait a minute, why is Riff Raff and Magenta even doing this when we know that they are agents? Spoiler alert, they're agents at the end who are supposed to capture Frank and take him back to his home planet. That's what he thinks. But it's like, why would he behave this way? And it's like, I'm not certain they knew the ending when they were writing the script. And obviously, when they finished the script, they didn't go back and fix it to make it make any more sense or lead it in. So it does feel like a stream of consciousness.
Tim Curry definitely steals the show. I'm glad he went full Tim Curry in, because if he'd have held back or tried to play that character more reserved, it would not have been as memorable or as successful, I don't think.
I presume that like Barry Bostwick and Susan Sarandon knew exactly what they were getting into, but the way that they have to play those characters, they're kind of straight-laced and kind of flat on purpose. But I'm glad that, like you said, Tim knew exactly what he was doing and just went for it, and it just makes it a joy to watch.
Well, how about that?
Every second he's on screen is fantastic.
Well, you definitely get this fish out of water feel from both Brad and Janet, and the fact that they're American actors and pretty much everyone else is a British actor kind of helps cement that, because they feel so out of place physically in the story, and also their characters. No, they don't talk or sound like anybody else there. And the way that Brad has like these awful stereotypical 50s.
Yes, Janet, life's pretty cheap to that type.
What kind of a place is this?
It's probably some kind of hunting lodge for rich weirdos.
Oh, we shouldn't judge them too harshly, Janet, but everything he says is so harsh. It's so judgmental.
Yeah, it's kind of that backwards way of thinking that you could see from older films from like a couple decades prior, where it was all like, you're a credit to your race, son. It's like, technically he thinks he's saying something nice, but it's still awful, you know?
Right. He's like, you're pretty good for a girl. Like, it's the same kind of idea.
Right. It's overall a pretty good time. I feel like the ending of it is almost kind of haphazardly put together. Not to get too much into spoilers. I mean, it's a 46-year-old movie. I'm sure everybody's aware of it. It's not that big a deal.
Yeah, if you haven't seen it, it's definitely worth a watch just out of blind curiosity. But it's a weird movie. And you kind of have to know that going into it, or otherwise you might be too off-put by some of the initial shock value, because it's designed to shock you. You have to know that the movie's going to get weird very, very quickly.
Yeah. And I think it does okay. I mean, I've watched some older movies that were quote-unquote groundbreaking when they came out, and they just did not work today. And it's just because all the movies that have been made since then have aped off of it in some capacity. So it's like, well, I've seen all this before, it does better. And this, I don't think really fits that. It stands out pretty well. Like I said, there's some things I'm all like, well, these days that's not very challenging, or that's not particularly divisive or anything like that. But for the most part, like it still works. We're still pretty transphobic. So him literally being a transvestite and a transsexual, even though that's not explicit, it's just what he calls himself, and it's also the name of the galaxy, I think. So it's touching on some of these things that are still kind of hot button topics today to a degree.
This is not a movie that was new to either of us. We grew up watching this. I think Dad showed it to us when we were very young. I mean, it's because that's the thing, is it's supposed to be shocking and taboo, but back in the 70s, it was supposed to be shocking and taboo. So even in like the mid-90s, it's a little strange, but it's not like, oh, I can't believe that man's wearing a dress. You know, it wasn't obscene to the extent that it was initially supposed to kind of be. So we watched this many times, and we've seen it for so long that we can kind of quote it without having to think very hard about it. So it's a movie that we're obviously going to have some nostalgia for and quite a bias on, but objectively speaking, how would you rate this movie?
I think that I would rate it a 7, which on our scale fits into a movie that you enjoy. You know, it's a good movie, but it has some flaws and you're willing to overlook those flaws.
So this is the start of our month-long horror movie month. We're going to watch a bunch of horror movies for the month of October. Started it off with something not so horrific, definitely horror-themed, absolutely, but we're going to kick it up. What's our next movie?
I, for one, am very excited about this month because I'm a big horror nerd, and we're going to pick a few things that I'm not that familiar with, and some things I've not seen at all, like our next feature, which is Devil Dog, which is a mysterious little movie that you found.
We're big fans of the Red Letter Media guys, and they do a lot of, what is this? Where did this come from? Who made this film? And when I saw this is, by the way, this glorious box art, yes, we have to watch this. Next time on Suspenders of Belief, Devil Dog.
See you there.